Hey, Eric, what here has inspired you the most?
Well, I think, I want to get Angela's thoughts as well. But so far there's been some interesting panels. It's the people, it's the conversations afterwards that have been great. There's so many interesting things that are going on in the healthcare industry,
Yeah, yeah.
and so as a provider, as a platform, it's really interesting and important to hear about all those things. So I don't know for you, Angela, what you've been finding interesting, but
I think for me, what's interesting is the confluence of trends and trying to separate what's a trend, what's something we should be paying attention to, versus what is something that's going to deeply impact the way healthcare is done now and in the future, and how we talk about and market it.
It's interesting, Eric. You control one of the largest, I would say, kind of media platforms around health, just a brand in all kinds of spaces in health. Anything you see here that kind of changes how U.S. News thinks about things?
yeah, obviously we do and have an important platform in best hospitals, and now we're doing, it's sort of doctor finders, which interesting from B2B and B2C. But when you come here, you just realize how complicated the healthcare industry is, and how it pervades everything. We know that it's call it 20% of the GDP, and it's from a media brand is great, but when you think about it from a public policy
Sure.
standpoint, and
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but I spent a number of years working for Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor De Blasio, and healthcare and life sciences fell under me
Oh, is that
in
true?
when I was in government,
Ah.
and you realize how difficult it is to sort of push things and how many effects are on it, and that's what comes to life right here. It's how do you move those
Yeah.
baby steps to change
Right.
the healthcare industry. So,
Right. Right.
but I look at it from a policy
Mm.
maker position. So I'd be interested in from someone from a doctor perspective,
Yeah.
or from someone doing sort of clinical research, how
Yeah.
how you guys look at it.
I think that innately, I think people in practice feel the complicated nature of medicine.
Yeah.
When you come here, you do get a little inspired that there are other people thinking about things, and things are moving and there are new ideas. But you're right; it's still complicated. It is still complicated. I don't know if I'm not sure if a lot has changed or a lot is changing, because it certainly feels like a maze sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, I just feel like there are these conflicting incentives in our system. They just continue to be pervasive, and they're layered, one on top of the other on top of
Sure.
the other, right? And so, how do we get back to basics?
Yeah.
I feel like one of the things I love seeing here, when you look at the work, you realize that the right content can change somebody's life when it comes to healthcare. So, to me, the opportunity to create health literacy
Mm,
by pushing that content out,
right.
how can we start to address some of these root cause issues and fix it from the bottom up,
Yeah.
instead of throwing media at it? Just how do we create that engagement with
Yeah.
patients?
Yeah.
Because to me, things like population health management, that is much less about, hey, let's make sure you're on your med, and much more about helping you understand why you should be invested in that decision for yourself.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you see, from your side, but it's something that really interests me and concerns me at the same time.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And Eric, you guys, talk about content that influences the world.
Yeah.
That is your daily life.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, it's interesting because when you say sort of content that influences, the consumer, I worry about the literacy not just at the consumer standpoint, but at the hospital administrator, at the doctor,
Sure.
and there's
Sure.
all these points of disconnect that if you're not, ensuring that everybody's literate, everybody's communicating, because
Yeah.
the language is very different. I think, when I was in government, we created all these programs that connected hospitals with consumers with companies, so that collectively they were able to sort of push the ball forward. And Garth, I mean, you talk, and Garth knows our platform at US News really well, because we're talking with some messaging to the hospital administrators, some to the consumers, and it's interesting, and we have this partnership with Garth and Aetna Foundation, and it's all about making sure that all those people, the doctors, the consumer, the policymaker, the community, that everybody together is working, because otherwise, you're not going to sort of push things forward.
Yeah. Healthcare is complicated.
Yeah.
I think.
It is complicated. Well, and you certainly can't have, to your point, one message hitting a consumer and then the doctor having a conflicting message back to the patient. And at the same time, someone was, making a joke about a consumer coming in and demanding a certain treatment because of the way that we currently market treatments, and the lack of knowledge around the impact of that. It's kind of shocking and
So
stunning to me.
I'll tell you a funny story. We had these newsletters that went to doctors. We did it in partnership with the American Medical Association. And what the doctors wanted to know was, in this world of Google and, in this world where there's all this information, consumers would go into doctors' offices thinking that they knew what that they looked at their symptoms, self-diagnosed, because you could read it in Google. They'd come in with fears that they had the worst disease in the world. And doctors wanted to know the stories that were out there beforehand, because consumers would come in, so they'd know, like, oh my God, this is the fifth person that thinks they have whatever, diabetes or whatever the case may be. So that's why it's important, because there's so much information out there that you're getting both players on the same page.
Yeah. So do you think, when you hear something like that, do you think that the world's getting more complicated for consumers?
I think it is. If you think about, what content do you trust? Who do you trust?
Sure.
Right? We're in the age of fake news, right? We all know it, right? So if I'm online and I'm going about my normal, news, conversation, etc., and I'm reading things, let's face it, we sponsor ads natively. It's a common practice in our industry. I feel like we have a responsibility as health marketers, as people in the healthcare space, to make sure that what we're putting out there is trusted news. But who's policing that?
Right.
And with consumers not really knowing what's right or wrong, how do you think we can contribute to that? I mean, it's a real challenge.